Okay. So we're here. We are at our last chapter on race and ethnicity, and tomorrow I'm going to also put up a test review for the final, and I'll have the final up sometime Saturday. I'm going to let it run until Tuesday evening. I'll let you know what time I'm going to be having to have those grades completely in by Tuesday, because I'm sure that they're due the next day. So, because the next summer session starts on Wednesday, so those grades are going to be due right away. So, make sure that you get your paper in and get all this done by Tuesday, no later. But I just want to say a couple of things just to introduce us to the concept of race and try to do so in a compact fashion here, since we don't have a lot of time on the video. But it's very important to be able to distinguish race from ethnicity. Race, historically, the concept of race has been conceived as a group of people that share certain genetic features. And so a racial group is distinguished along physical lines. So the identity of the group is based along physical lines, whereas an an ethnic group is based on perceived cultural differences. So cultural differences such as nationality, language, and religion can define an ethnic group. The term ethnicity is somewhat more flexible than the term race is. But in fact, as we've talked about in the first chapter, and as you'll see in listening about I have a short video on the history of the concept of race, that most social scientists today now see that race is a myth biologically. That is, biologically, there's no such thing as a race of people. I may have said this earlier. We're like cats. There's only one species of cats, and the only thing is that they come in various colors and shapes and different physical features. Same thing with human beings. We've evolved over millions of years, and in terms of environment, has affected the melanin count. Melanin is the chemical in the skin that controls skin tone, and I'll speak about that shortly. So race, on a biological level, the sheer biological existence of race is a myth. There's no such thing as distinct races of people biologically. And so for some people that's hard to get over, because they've been taught their whole life. And it's so ingrained in our culture that there are these differences simply by the superficial aspects of skin tone, various facial features, hair tone, this hair form, texture, this kind of thing. Very superficial genetically. And yet we base so much importance on these socially in terms of the organization of our societies, that in our culture we actually teach our children that there are these perceived differences. And we're also have been taught that in our school through the media. But that taken for granted reality is totally mythological. There is no such thing biological. Now, saying that, race is a very salient and important cultural, social concept. It has had massive, for the most part, really negative impacts on groups of people historically. Simply segregating and discriminating against people simply on the basis of physical features such as skin color. So to say that it's not real biological does not mean that race does not exist culturally, and that's where that's where people make meaning out of this issue of differences in this color of our skin. But we can't really delineate. I'm sorry. For example, where white skin stops and dark skin begins, because it's a continuum. The color variations varies widely across human populations and across individuals. And what we find genetically is that within any so-called race of people, the physical diversity is much more there's much more diversity within a population of people than there is across. So, for example, in Africa, where human beings originated in Africa, there's more genetic variation in sub-Saharan Africa than there is anywhere else in the world, and so there's apt to be much more diversity, such as skin tone and other features, much more so, and genetically speaking, in terms of our shared genetic background is much more diverse within a group than it is across groups. So let's put it another way, there is likely to be as much genetic similarities between a person from the so-called Caucasian or white race with an African American than there is between, let's say, a neighboring Caucasian neighbor or an African American neighbor. They may have more genetic similarities to each other than they do within their own grouping, so-called racial grouping. So we know this genetically as genetic fact. But that still does not get us out of the fog of race and racism and discrimination and prejudice as the chapter goes into discussing. But in terms of skin color, I just want to spend a few minutes. The major is accepted. It is theory, though it seems to be gaining wide acceptance, but it's still in the theoretical aspect. It's not totally been proven factually. That there is a lot of evidence to support this, that thousands and thousands of years ago, when we were all in Africa, yes, our ancestors, our ancient ancestors, do track back to Africa regardless of our skin color. And if you were to ask the question, which came first, dark skin or light skin, I would say that the facts show that it would have been dark skin. We originated in Africa, and in Africa and other areas of the world near the equator where there's a lot more intense sunlight, there was an evolutionary adaptation. An evolutionary adaptation where the skin melanin was much darker, much richer. Why is that? Well, to protect us from the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And it also protects against skin cancer. So it is an ecological adaptation. It is an evolutionary adaptation. So, several 100,000 years ago, as human beings began to migrate out of Africa into all corners of the world, and especially as they began to migrate northward into the northern climes, there was another genetic adaptation to the lack of sunlight. If any of you, like myself, have lived in northern climes, I lived in Canada for 4 years, as well as Michigan. And in the winter months, most of your days are clouded over. There's not a lot of sunlight. And because of that clouded over lack of sunlight, we don't get as much vitamin D into the skin. And so this is, the theory is that in those northern climes, like up in Finland and other places where groups were living, in order for the children to get adequate vitamin D into their skin, and to allow that to get as much from of the vitamin D they could absorb from the sunlight that was blocked, the melanin in our skin began to lighten. That is, began to lose melanin, and so that would allow for the lighter skin allows for to absorb more vitamin D from the environment. Darker skin helps, in the contrast, helps to limit the amount of overabundance of vitamin D because of the abundance of sunlight near the equator. And so this is a very practical, very convincing theory to me. As this is why we see, for example, if you were to look into the Sahara, you would, if you compare that to, say, somebody in a farther northern clime like Finland, you might come to the conclusion that there's one group of people that's white skin, light skin, another group of people that are very dark skin. But if you were to walk from the equator and start walking northward, what you would find would be a gradual lightening up as you walked northward. We can track these differences. Once you get to the Middle East, skin starts lightening, and it goes on until you reach very light. So there is no point along that trip that we could say this is where we go from the dark race to the light race. It's simply a rainbow. It's simply a continuum. So I think this is a good place to start, and it's a good place to think about race and its complexity and its relationship biologically and culturally, and how we distinguish those two is very important. Race is a cultural concept. And when we say that, what we mean is that race takes on meaning for human beings. And we've organized as the great African American sociologist W.B. Du Bois. He said, that one of the central theme that's worked in organizing Western societies has been along the racial color line. And certainly, our history is steeped in racial distinctions and discrimination. So go ahead and start with this chapter, and I will do another short one to talk a little bit about some other aspects of that chapter here shortly. Okay, talk to you later.